Well, let me start by thanking the wonderful CIS and its founder and CEO, Greg Lindsay, for inviting me to speak here today. And on the off chance this is being recorded, and at some point our Attorney General and Prime Minister happen to be listening, I'd also like to thank Team Australia for the victim for long enough to allow today's event to happen. Thank you very much. It's refreshing to know that Team Australia doesn't have a veto on absolutely everything that needs to take place in this country. Sorry. So in my 12 or 13 minutes, I want to do three things. To start, and it'll slightly overlap with Surrey, I'd like to give you a potted account of the two main philosophical schools of thought in the Western tradition that support classical liberalism generally, but more importantly, that support scope for free speech, more particularly. And then secondly, I want to move to this claim. I'd like to argue that at some point, in order to test someone's commitment to free speech, you have to put aside the abstract arguments that take place up in the Olympian heights of moral abstractions and look to see his or her answers to more specific scenarios as to whether you would suppress or tolerate speech. So if I can put that differently, up in the Olympian heights of abstractions, everyone says they're in favor of free speech. I spent 2 years traveling around Australia debating George Williams on a Bill of Rights, and I'd always start, who's in favor of the right to free speech? And everyone put his or her hand up. I was waiting for the day that a guy in a brown shirt with a little mustache might say he's against free speech. Never happened. So everyone says they're in favor of free speech. I mean, heck, Tim Wilson's colleague, the Race Relations Commissioner, he says he's in favor of free speech. So does Mr. Finkelstein. So does the Green Party. I mean, that level of debate is worthless. You need to descend down into the quagmire of sort of real life issues to see where people stand. So if you're in favor of suppressing speech in some rare scenario here and there, incitement to murder, blocking publication of some new easy-to-make biological weapon, that's quite compatible with holding a strong attachment to free speech. But as the instances grow of when you would silence speech, then the plausibility of your being someone who's committed to free speech becomes basically ever more tenuous. If you're preferencing someone's desire not to be offended, if you're saying that counts more for you than allowing lots of scope for articulating views that will inevitably offend others, then really you're not a free speech adherent. You can say it, you're just not. So put bluntly, many people who profess an attachment to free speech palpably don't have one. And it's getting worse, actually, in the West in the last 3 or 4 decades. So I'm going to run through some real life scenarios, and you can decide for yourself if you would suppress or allow speech. So that's the second thing I'm going to do. And lastly, the third thing, I want to test your patience, and this will be short, and I suppose I'm also going to be testing the patience of Liberal Senator Dean Smith, one of my fellow later panelists, and member of this government that broke its clear pre-election promise on this. But I'm going to say a few words about hate speech in Section 18C to finish. So firstly, the sort of brief potted theoretical overview, somewhat overlapping with Surrey. So basically in the liberal tradition, you have your Capulets and your Montagues. You can call them, if you like, your natural law believers and your consequentialists. Now, the natural law believers, that's the home of John Locke, Thomas Jefferson, and many of the thinkers in the Enlightenment that came from continental Europe, Kant, lots from France. The consequentialists, the other school of thought, and these are both groups that support free speech. The latter is the home of John Stuart Mill, Bentham. By the way, John Stuart Mill had a nervous breakdown in his teenage years editing Bentham. If you've ever read any Bentham, you'd have a nervous breakdown too. He thinks in flowcharts. He's probably the most successful reformer in the history of the world, Jeremy Bentham. But he had the worst prose writing style of all time. My mom would have gone crazy reading it. And my favorite philosopher of all time, David Hume, also Surrey's. So that's the part of the Enlightenment that often will get praised as the Scottish Enlightenment. So I'm going to lay my cards on the table right now. I'm in Mill's and Hume's camp. I'm a consequentialist. Utilitarianism is a sub-branch of consequentialism. But let's start with the natural law camp. So natural law arguments, and I'm being brief now, they're of the sort where you claim something is a good in itself. So a right to equality is a good in itself, or perhaps a right to property, or, relevant to today, free speech. So in this way of thinking, we humans are entitled to these things. Well, why? Well, because we're humans, or because of some convoluted social contract argument, or it's because what a benevolent theistic God wants. So we're entitled to this claimed thing, certain scope for free speech, say, regardless of the consequences that are likely to attach to granting it to us. Now, this is a long-standing and powerful school of thought. For me, it has no attraction for me. I see it as more sort of repackaged theology. It's sort of otherworldly and unconvincing. As soon as you rule out looking at consequences, I think it's hard to see things in those terms. My sense is that that's the sort of Tim Wilson defense of free speech. It's that core natural law one. Pick up Amnesty International, pick up any of the sort of mean self-styled human rights groups. They tend to be natural law adherents. But as I said, Tim won't mind me disagreeing with him because he's pretty much the only human rights commissioner we have who believes in free speech. So he's open to a little bit of disagreement. Then we have the consequentialist defenders of rights. And I'm now talking about free speech. And this is the home of John Stuart Mill. And if you've never read any of the philosophers, just read Mill. It's a shortcut. And Mill ties his defense of the value of free speech to good consequences. So, you throw everything into the hopper, and societies where people have very few limits on what they can say do better. So that sort of thinking is consistent with admitting that there are real harms when people say things and hurt other people's feelings, because there are. Or when you insult them, or when someone utters hate-filled words. But the point is that the good consequences of allowing that speech outweigh the bad ones. And so to start, even for Mill, even wrong-headed and hurtful speech can force those who hold sort of more defensible views to think again, to better justify their opinions, and not to leave out the further benefit of having to articulate them more persuasively to convince other people. And this is the one that Mill's probably more famous for, but pretty wide open speech creates this crucible of competing opinions where over time, at least if you're an optimist, so that rolls out Mr. Finkelstein, but if you're an optimist in this crucible of competing ideas, the better ideas will gain traction against the worse ideas. That requires, of course, that you're optimistic about the capacities of your fellow citizens. So you need to believe that a plumber or a secretary is as capable as you are of seeing through the idiocies of some Holocaust denier. If you don't think that, if you think you need 3 or 4 degrees, I've got so many degrees, it's not crazy, but there's no reason for thinking that everybody in society isn't as competent as you are and as capable as you are for seeing through these things. And at the heart of the sort of Millian idea of free speech is this is a confidence in your fellow citizens. I'm going to come back to this when I compare hate speech laws in the US. They do not exist. The hate speech laws in most of continental Europe, where every second piece of legislation seems to be aimed at some sort of hate speech law. And where do the sort of groups that might plausibly fall under the rubric of Team Australia do better? Do the Muslims and Jews do better in the US, where there's not a single hate speech law? Or do they do better in France? It's a no-brainer where they do better, and I'm going to tell you why in a minute. So it does require you to think, this guy who hasn't gone to university is a plumber, he can see through the Holocaust denier just as easily as I can. If you don't think that, and if you ever had the misfortune of reading Mr. Finkelstein's report, he doesn't think that. He has a sort of total lack of confidence in Australians. It's a bit insulting, actually, when people worry that your average Australian is sort of somehow comparable to your average German during the Weimar Republic. But as long as you think the average person is as morally capable as you are, the John Stuart Mill argument is incredibly powerful. Again, I think a lot of people in society just don't have that confidence in their fellow citizens. But if I can return to my core point, For Mill, even false opinions play a role in generating good consequences. And Mill goes so far as to say that if there's some view not represented, it's almost worth having a government person put the point of view. So on top of those benefits, then there are all the benefits that come when you think about the dangers of overreach. You know, think of the dangers of overreach. If you're not a free speech proponent, when somebody, it's usually the government, has the power to decide who can say what. Any rule is, you know, going in is going to be over and under inclusive. It's going to hit too many people. It's going to hit more people than were planned. In other words, at some point, the regulator will go too far. Think Mr. Andrew Bolt. So all rules, however you frame them, will inevitably be over-inclusive at some point. It doesn't matter what somebody's intentions are. And you know that in advance, and that's a bad consequence that you can factor in advance. And it should be factored in advance. And then there's all the good consequences from not allowing anyone to play the self-styled victim. You are doing society a favor when you say to people, grow a thick skin. Again, Muslims do better in the US, where there's no hate speech laws at all, than they do in France and Germany, where the governments are bending over backwards to sort of propitiate hurt feelings and that sort of stuff. Or in France, or in Denmark. The whole of continental Europe seems to be on the wrong path to me. And then you can weigh up the good and bad consequences. When you're doing that, you need to also remember this. Again, an idea that comes from Mill. Everyone is in favor of speech that is flattering and praising and saying, you know, what a witty, fine fellow is Jim. You know, nobody's trying to stop that kind of speech. If you are committed to a program or a doctrine of lots of protection for free speech, you're not worried about the kind of speech where everyone's, you know, holding hands and singing Kumbaya and saying the world's great. Nobody tries to stop that speech. You know, even in North Korea, you can say nice things about the Kims. The good consequences for society flow from being able to say the not nice things about the Kims. That's where the good consequences flow from. So Mill's defense of liberalism and of free speech is precisely of this Benthamite consequentialist flavor. He just writes better than Bentham. But so you throw all the consequences into the pot, and you recognize up front, it's a bad consequence when someone is humiliated with nasty words. But you see if there are enough competing, outweighing good consequences, so that on balance, it's a good idea. And remember, a doctrine of free speech is not saying we should go out and be bigots. It's saying, which our Attorney General should have said, that on balance, letting bigots speak has good consequences for society. And then we encourage it, that it just works out better in the long run. And that is correct in my view. So Mill, you know, recognizes that not all speech is allowable under this what are the consequences test. There will be some speech that should be silenced. So when anyone says, you know, Mill was an absolutist on free speech, he was not. When people say that those who want to repeal Section 18C are absolutist, well, A, that's a joke. They have no clue what's going on in the US and Canada. And B, it's not even close to an absolutist position. So again, Mill is not an absolutist on free speech, but he would allow a heck of a lot more than most commentators in Australia today. And I'm really of Mill's way of thinking. And I think his framework for addressing the issue is significantly preferable to the sort of mysticism that I think lies at the heart of natural law thinking. Right. Second point. My mum must be in the audience. Thank you, Mum. I could say anything for my mum. She likes whatever I say. My dad's a little more... Right. So let's just move down now from the Olympian heights where we're all in favor of free speech, or we all say we are, to look at a few specifics. So let's take it for granted that everyone from Julia Gillard to the plaintiffs in the Bolt litigation would say they have an attachment to the abstract principle of free speech. And we're going to descend down to some, now, get away from that sort of disagreement finessing abstraction. Just as an aside, that's why bills of rights are so dangerous, because they're pitched at a level where you just finesse away all disagreement and everyone can say they're in favor. and you just leave it for the judges to make all important decisions. Right, another problem. But so I want to give you a series of instances where free speech is a core concern, and then you decide if you would allow the speech or not. And I think some of these times the answer might be yes, but my claim is that if you're on the side of suppression more than 2 or 3 times, you're not really the free speech adherent you think you are. So scenario A, I'm making these up, and any connection to real life scenarios I leave you wholly to decide for yourself. So scenario A, a newspaper columnist discusses affirmative action benefits flowing to Aboriginal people, and this columnist argues that such benefits ought not to go to those who are 1/16th, 1/32nd, 1/64th Aboriginal. You can take it as read that the columnist really, really, really hurts some of their feelings. So would you allow that speech or not? And what if the columnist gets some facts wrong? Would you allow the speech or not? What if the columnist's tone is really mocking and sarcastic? That's scenario A. Scenario B. Some firebrand cleric preaches to his followers and incites them to violence. Now, Mill would stop that speech. I would too. But not everybody would. So would you allow that speech or not? What if the cleric does not incite them to violence, but instead simply incites hatred for some other group? Almost all of our politicians in Australia want to stop that. I would not. I think there's a real benefit in knowing what some crazy cleric thinks if he's just inciting hatred. And why do you want to drive that underground? It's not like they're changing their minds. You know, there's three people you focus on when you think about free speech. You think about the people speaking. There's no plausible way of thinking that suppression laws change those people's views. You think about listeners because you're worried that the psycho cleric is going to convince them, and again, that relates to your confidence in your fellow Australians. And then the last group is the hearers, right? And I don't know, if someone's saying really nasty things about me, I would like to know about it. But so allow that or not. Here's a third scenario. Some evangelical Christian is a strong opponent of homosexuality. He writes flyers condemning the practice in very strong terms. Would you allow that or not? If you would allow that, what if the evangelical man argues that all homosexuals are going to hell? Allow that or not? Or that they should not be allowed to be teachers or ever to adopt children? Basically, you can't say a lot of that in the UK. Fourth scenario. What if some publication published drawings mocking Christ's crucifixion? Would you allow that or not? The answer in Australia is yes. If you would, change it from mocking Christ to mocking Muhammad in some way. Would you allow that or not? And here we get, so if the answer then is no, is your answer only because you're afraid for your life? And if that is, and I would call it a rather refreshingly honest answer, because that seems to me what motivates a lot of people, fear for their life. It's not the end of the world, to be honest about that. But what do you think should be done about the fact that fear is the sole thing that prevents such speech? Greg hinted at some problems here. He's just putting on talks. Do you think such violent tactics, and I have been saying, nobody listened to me, but I've been saying this since the Danish cartoons, but do you think such violent threats to kill people or to actually kill them would work if, taking, say, the Danish cartoons, once you have the threat, every major publication, newspapers, magazines, which otherwise would not publish whatever we're talking about, cartoons, whatever, they would not normally publish them because they're distasteful. But once the threat comes in, if every major publication now publishes them for 3 straight days, with the caveat that the drawings will be run for a further week if any violence is visited on anyone, those threats would stop very quickly, in my view. They would be seen by everyone to be counterproductive. There is no backbone anymore in a lot of the Western press. Fifth scenario. On the subject of religion, if someone writes something that is considered as blasphemous by a small group of adherents of some religion or other, would you allow that speech or not? They came within 1 vote in the UK of bringing in laws that effectively would have done that. And there's a big lobby group of countries in the UN trying to do it. Here's a 6th one. Let's call it the Corporal Manning example. Here we have someone who has joined and so agreed to all the limits that go with being a member of the US Army. Now, this person then finds he has access to military secrets, and for non-monetary reasons, he opts to take them and publish them. All right, so do you agree that once caught and convicted, he should be subjected to the full force of the law? Well, personally, I do. The right to free speech is not a right to steal things. And there you go. I don't know how you, to the extent that there are limits on free speech, incitement to violence, some sort of obscenity, the one throughout history that's really almost everyone thinks there's some road for inroads into free speech is concerns about national security. In World War II, you put more limits on free speech in Britain than you had when it wasn't World War II. And that seems to me to be sensible, and it works on a cost-benefit analysis type thinking. Scenario G. A rather well-known actor doing work in a different country describes a minority group as colored people. Would you allow that or not? If you would not want the government to suppress that, what about if private citizens caused such a huge outcry that the actor, for reasons to do with his career or perhaps out of sincere regret, gave a groveling apology? This obviously, some of you will know this is a real life one I'm doing. Do you like that outcome or not? What if in that country the phrase people of color was perfectly acceptable, but the phrase colored people was not? You can say people of color, but you can't say colored people. Would that matter to you? Or what if the largest lobby group for this minority was known as the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People? Is that relevant? Two more scenarios. Second last, a journalist has a source who alleges misconduct by the security services in their fight against terrorism. The source is credible and gives information to the journalist who publishes it. The government takes the journalist to court, threatening jail if the source is not revealed. Should such a journalist be allowed to publish without revealing her source? Key question these days. Does it matter to you whether the journalist put the allegation to the government first and gave it a chance to respond? That might matter to some of you. And then we'll finish with the hoary old example of the Holocaust denier. Would you allow that speech? Absolutely in the US, which has the second largest and most successful group of Jewish people in the world. And they're not flocking to leave the US to move to France. And if so, what if a group of neo-Nazis were to organize, so a group of neo-Nazis deliberately decide to have a march, go through a suburb of the town in the US they can find that has the highest concentration of Holocaust survivors, and they deliberately target that? Would you allow that to happen? In the US, the answer is yes. As I said, if you ask people in the abstract, virtually everyone claims to be in favor of free speech. I have yet to find someone who says otherwise. To separate the wheat from the chaff, you need to get some specifics. So if you find yourself on the side of speech suppression and say more than 3 or 4 of those examples, maybe 2 or 3, I suspect you're not quite the free speech supporter you imagine. And my sense is, totally, undocumented, no hard-line statistical analysis, so I could fit into any sociology department in Australia. But my sense is that there are fewer supporters of free speech in the West today than you might think or wish to be the case. And I certainly don't see enough evidence of it amongst our MPs on both sides of politics. And I see no evidence of it on the massively subsidized by taxpayers ABC. Which takes me to the third and final point on 18C, which I'll be brief. Because there's been so much written on the topic, some of it by me. But look, to start, on no conceivable reading of John Stuart Mill would offense, as in, oh, my feelings have been hurt, ever be allowed to trump speech. I'm not sure it would make you a very good parent either. Secondly, when I voted for this government last election, I thought that it, like me, was on Mill's side of the debate. Thirdly, on issues of principle, it seems to me it's infinitely preferable to put something to the Senate and have them block it than not to put it to the Senate at all. Fourthly, despite what I've said earlier in this paper, I really haven't got a clue what Team Australia means, and I've thought about it. And I certainly not clear why the fear of hurt feelings of some subgroup of citizens of this country ought to override repeal of a statutory provision where that repeal would have clear, significant, good consequences for this country, but I'm sure that we'll find out later from Dean Smith what that is. For comparative purposes, let me just finish by repeating what I mentioned already and what many of you already know. No hate speech laws at all in the United States. None. Meanwhile, as I said, continental European democracies are bending over backwards to enact them, and nobody can say they're working. On no conceivable account of how things are going in continental Europe can you say that the groups that plausibly make up Team Australia type concerns do better than they would and do in the US. On the other hand, if you doubt that anywhere in the Western democracy there's the political will and conviction to overcome what I think of as the self-styled victims brigades, you need to go and have a chat to Canadian Prime Minister Stephen Harper. You see, a year and a half, 2 years ago, he got Canada's national equivalent of Section 18C repealed after years of trying. And he took more heat than Tony Abbott. And here's the thing. He did it through a private member's bill, which is a clever way of doing it. There were claims, as you can imagine, as there have been here in Australia, that the sky would fall for Jews, for Muslims, for natives, you name it. 2 years later, not a single solitary horror prediction has come true. Won't surprise anyone in this room. I'm betting that members of the Green Party of Australia and even Tim's colleague, the Race Relations Commissioner, are still prepared to travel to Canada. Despite the fact they haven't got a hate speech law at the national level, they are still prepared to go to Canada and visit and holiday. So allow me to close by offering you two quotes from two big-ticket thinkers. Thomas Jefferson famously once said, "The price of liberty is eternal vigilance." So in the Western world these past 3 or 4 decades, you'd be really hard-pressed to describe the overriding attitude to freedom using the adjective vigilance. In fact, it's way worse than that. And then there's my favorite philosopher of all time, and I think Surrey's too, and he was actually a wonderful person to boot, which is quite unusual for philosophers. The core figure, I mean, you look at Rousseau and Marx, they were just really awful human beings. The core figure in the Scottish Enlightenment, Adam Smith once said this of David Hume. He said he was the most nearly perfect man I have ever met. He liked to drink, he liked to gamble, he wrote clearly, he was a very nice person. David Hume, and Hume once said, and let me quote, "It is seldom that liberty of any kind is lost all at once. No, you lose it in small steps when well-meaning people," and I think just about everyone in Australia in this debate is well-meaning, but when well-meaning people reckon it's just not worth the effort to be bothered to defend something. And cabinet ministers then, on this account, put their careers in chauffeur-driven cars and perhaps a core belief that, they're so important they can do more good if they stay in cabinet, ahead of resigning from cabinet when a government fails to put a needed repeal package to the Senate. I was still stunned that not a single cabinet minister thought it was worth resigning from cabinet over. And MPs worry more about the immigrant vote than upholding a core Western value. And so some small piece of our freedom to speak remains off limits because that's just easier. So Hume's point is that taking away the next piece then becomes easier still. And we came really close to that with Julia Gillard's proposed media laws. So I'm of Hume's mind, and again, I thank Greg and the CIS and all of you for coming today and inviting me. Thank you.